everyone, welcome to Pitch a Publisher, Pro Tips from an Editor. This is going to be a presentation on my suggestions and tips and general unsolicited advice for submitting your manuscript to a traditional publisher. So let's dive in. Oh, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Emily MacKinnon. I am the children's editor at Nimbus Publishing. I'm about to go on maternity leave, though, hence your pre-recorded presentation here. So unfortunately, I will not be available for specific feedback after the presentation, but I'm happy to hopefully give you some comprehensive advice here. I'm going to start off with a question that we get asked very often at Nimbus, which is, what does a publisher actually do? We get a lot of phone calls from prospective authors who ask questions like, when can I get my book published with you? How much does it cost to get my book printed? And similar questions. So from what I take from that is that people are a little bit confused about the difference between traditional publishing and self-publishing. The main difference is a traditional publisher receives submissions. So the editors will go through the submissions and pick and choose the projects that they're most interested in. With a traditional publisher, there's no cost for the author. So the publisher will shoulder all costs associated with editing, marketing, designing, printing, and shipping your book. It does not cost the author anything. It might cost the author some sanity because it takes forever. It's a really, really slow process. Nimbus right now has 3 editors reviewing on average 300 to 500 submissions in a year. That's on top of the submissions that come in through agents and submissions that come in through authors that we've worked with previously. So it's a lot of work for 3 people, and it's sort of why it takes so long, because there's a lot that goes into reviewing a manuscript. So right now, Nimbus is reviewing submissions from 2019, 2020, and they are being published in 2024, 2025. So the lead time is, 4 to 5 years. So I understand how frustrating that is for some authors, and they choose to self-publish just based on the timeline alone. You get a lot more control if you self-publish in terms of the timeline, but also in terms of things like editing, design, cover, things like that. But also with self-publishing, you are in charge of paying for all of that stuff yourself. So if you want to have your book edited by a professional, you will have to pay the going rate for an editor to go through it and edit it. You would also have to pay for a designer, and you would also have to pay for a marketing and PR team if that's something that you were interested in. With a traditional publisher, the author does not pay for any of that, which is why it's so competitive. The other big difference is money in terms of sales. So when you work with a traditional publisher, because you don't pay for any of that stuff up front, you receive a royalty on the sales. So the going rate for the book industry in North America is 10%. So you receive 10% of every sale of your book, and you get a check twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. If you self-publish, you get to retain 100% of all of your sales. But again, you have to recoup some of those initial costs that you had at the beginning stage. So there are some differences. There are pros and cons to both, definitely. So it really just depends on you and your project. If you have a very time-sensitive project, traditional publishing might not be the best option just because of how slow it is. Let's dive right into the different types of manuscripts for children's books. First and foremost, the sort of genre that we get pitched more than any other kidlit genre is picture books. These guidelines, I want to just make very clear, are general. They are by no means the be-all, end-all rule book, but they will hopefully provide some general parameters so you have a better idea of what publishers are thinking when they're reviewing picture book manuscripts. Okay, in general, the word count is somewhere between 600 and 1,000 words. Obviously, there are picture books that are shorter. There are picture books that have no words. There are picture books that are, 2,000, 3,000 words. But in general, you're looking for a story that sort of caps out around 1,000 words. For children, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm saying picture books are aimed at readers 3 to 5. So there's an actual story, presumably. This is a little bit more involved than, say, a board book. There's an arc and there are characters and that sort of thing. So one of the things that we like to see is that the action or the conflict is starting as soon as possible. There's no need to really set up a scene with picture books because there are illustrations. So you don't need to say things like, it was a snowy day in mid-November, because that doesn't really mean a whole lot to a 3-year-old. They don't really know what November means, and they would be able to see that it was a snowy day from the pictures. So you're able to just dive right into the action on page sort of 1 or 2, because we want to get the interest of the reader hooked straight away. One thing I always tell authors is to resist the urge to over-explain. And this is really hard with picture books because, you don't have the finished book in front of you. And if you're not an artist yourself, maybe you're having a hard time visualizing what the art will actually look like. So just try to remember that there will be artwork to go with your words. So you don't need to over-explain those things. Let the artwork do that heavy lifting. And sometimes the artwork can even add little context clues and things like that aren't necessarily in the words. There's a lot of fun to be had with the art. So it doesn't need to be overly dense and explanatory in the words. At this age, repetition is highly effective. I say this with some caution because I think repetition of phrases is really great, but make sure you read your story aloud so that the repetition doesn't become tiresome or become overly repetitious, if that makes any sort of sense. It's just the repetition is good because children will come to recognize that repetition and they might start to parrot it, and it will help them feel confident that they know what's coming and involved with the story. But too much repetition and it's just boring and weird. So there is a fine balance, and unfortunately I don't have, like a magic formula, like repeat every 25 words or something like that. It's not that formulaic. It really is just a matter of reading it out loud and seeing what works best with the rhythm and with the story. And this is just a personal one for me, but I prefer if the story just ends quickly and there's no sort of moral finger wagging at the end. There are some picture books that do that really well, but I don't think we need like that summary of like, and in the end, the lesson was, don't cross the street without looking both ways. Children are able to sort of internalize those messages without that really direct instruction. So it's just not necessary at the end of the picture book. Just let it be a story. It doesn't have to be a life lesson. And just let the story stand on its own and trust that your readers will get the lesson that's inherent in the story from the story without you having to explicitly point it out. The little writing tip here in the corner is just another personal preference, but I find a lot of sort of big topic issues, so things like race and gender and social class and body size and just different things like that, things that would be considered hot button topics. Your story doesn't have to explore those with animals, Like there are lots of good examples of stories that do that with animals. I'm thinking of What If Bunny's Not a Bully, or A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo, and Tango Makes Three. There's some really great explorations of these big topics, but they have animals. And I think if the point is to explore these topics that are relevant to children, then they should feature children. That's just, again, my personal preference, but I'm really seeing a trend towards those big topic books being told through the lens of animals and anthropomorphized animals, and it's just not necessary. I don't think it's cute, but kids can read stories about other kids, so just something to keep in mind. Next, we have my personal favorite genre of all, which is middle grade fiction, and this would be aimed at readers aged probably 8 to 12. In general, middle grade word count is between 25 and 40,000 words. Again, can be less, can be more. I wouldn't say any less than 25,000 words because, you want it to be meaty enough for there to be a story arc and a plot and, some character development. And that's really hard to do in under 25,000 words. It's certainly possible, but again, most publishers, if they see that your manuscript is, 19,000 words, they might be a little bit hesitant. If they see that your manuscript is 50 or 60,000 words for this age range, they will also be hesitant because that is too long. So somewhere in between 25 and 40 is ideal. The biggest thing with middle grade is there's a really intense sort of temptation for authors to over-explain and talk down, but I know it's not intentional, but it does come across as talking down to their readers because their readers are still very young, and this might be one of their first chapter books that they've ever read. So something to try to keep in mind is to always respect your reader and to allow them to draw their own conclusions of your problems that you've presented and to have their own reactions. So you don't need to tell the reader, she was sad because of this. You can just have a scene, and this is sort of edging on that show don't tell rule that everyone loves to harp on about. But it's just, you don't have to be so explicit of like, she was sad because XYZ. Allow the readers to have their own conclusions because maybe if they were in that situation, they wouldn't feel sad. Maybe they would feel embarrassed, or maybe they would feel shame or anger. Allow them to have their own reactions. You don't have to spell everything out so explicitly. The thing that a lot of people struggle with middle grade is this notion of interiority. So when I say interiority, I'm talking about the protagonists, usually the protagonist, sometimes the narrator, their inner thoughts and their reactions. So when you're writing your middle grade protagonist, you're sort of in the role of your character's therapist. So you should always be putting them in situations and then asking your character, how does that feel? And then writing what the character would say as an answer to that question. Because you want the reader to really empathize with your main character. That is their way into the story, and that is who they are experiencing the story through. So you want them to align themselves with that character. It's really hard to do with third-person narration. So third person being the way Harry Potter is written. So Harry went to the train station and got, onto the train. Instead of first person, which would be I went to the train station and I got onto the train. It's hard to have interiority with third person because it's kind of awkward to say that you know what someone is thinking. So a way around this is to just say, say your character's name is, Isadora. Isadora thought that XYZ. Isadora felt that XYZ. To Isadora, it looked like, and there are different ways that you can sort of involve that interiority with your character. Really important in middle grade. The other thing is that problems shouldn't be solved too easily. So say Isadora is going on an adventure and she's trying to find her missing cat. If she finds the cat after, the first obstacle she faces, that's not the most exciting. It's not the most interesting. So let's have problems that are a little bit more complex, that involve a little bit of character growth on Isadora's part. Maybe something that involves her doing something that she didn't feel she was brave enough to do or smart enough to do or, any number of things. And she has to explore herself and come up with, a way to solve the problem. And the thing that is so fun about middle grade is that it's sort of those stumbling blocks, those mistakes and getting into trouble and doing things that they're not supposed to and figuring things out. That is like the delicious joy of childhood, right? Like that's that adventuring spirit that children really see themselves in. So make sure you lean into that because that's like the beautiful part of middle grade, I think. It's a little bit lighter in focus and energy and tone than YA. So, a lot of YA has this sort of dystopian angle or like the chosen one narrative of like one teen to save the world. Middle grade is a little less serious, but it allows you to have a little bit more fun that way. But you always do need to be asking what happens next, and then what, to keep that plot chugging along at a good pace. Because the readers are so young, they really do need that action to happen quickly and to keep up the action and the pace throughout the manuscript. The last fiction category is young adult or YA fiction. The word count I've given here as the general guideline is between 40 and 60,000 words. Again, probably less than 40,000. A publisher might be hesitant because YA tends to explore deeper topics, the readers have a little bit more energy and focus, so they're able to read longer books. But you probably don't want to go a whole lot more than 60 or 70,000 words. The average adult novel, just for context, is around 80 to 90,000 words. So, so much depends on like the trim size of the book and the font size and, the margins and all that stuff. But in general, 40 to 60,000 words would be like between 200 and 300 pages in like a trade paperback. So that's sort of the sweet spot for YA. These books tend to be more issue-driven. There's a real tendency for YA authors to write books that are issue-driven. This was a big thing in the 90s, like books about HIV and AIDS and books about eating disorders and books about self-harm and, all of these sort of things, which are great. I'm not saying that those books don't have value. I'm just saying that those issue-driven books of the 90s and early 2000s in particular often miss the mark tone-wise because they're adults writing about things that they think are important for kids to know. And that tone, that sort of moralizing tone, teens in particular are so attuned to. The moment they feel that someone is wagging their finger or that someone's trying to teach them something or that something comes off as ringing not quite authentic, they're out. And they will be ruthless. I don't know if you've ever looked at some of the Goodreads reviews of some popular YA books, but like teen reviewers will hold nothing back. So they're very sensitive to authenticity in particular and tone. That's why dialogue is so crucial. You want to try to avoid terms and language that are going to date your book. Things like, dude or sweet or like tubular, all that stuff really shows that you have not spoken to a teen in the last 5 years. So just try to talk like you would talk to any teen. Don't talk to like the way that you think a teen would talk or should talk. If you haven't spoken to a teen or you don't know any teens, a good way around this is to read some YA that's currently on the market and see how they do it. Because those books are popular for a reason, because teenagers, feel like they are seen, that they are done well, and that they are interested in those topics, and they feel that they're well done. So reading popular YA is really important if you're going to write YA. Because YA is longer, there's more room for those sort of writerly tendencies to set the scene, have a little bit more exposition. There's a little more room for, being authorly. So you can write more description. It doesn't have to be so much dialogue and snappy action. It still does need dialogue and snappy action, but there's room to pad it a bit more with, those passages of that sort of flowery, fun, poetic language that's so fun to write. When you're writing a longer manuscript, I'm assuming most of you listening to this either have a manuscript in progress or have a finished manuscript, or maybe you have, an outline or an idea. So what I like to say, especially for longer fiction, and this would apply to middle grade as well, but I find it particularly helpful with longer manuscripts, is to visualize your first draft as what you see in your head. So you see the story in your head, just word vomit it onto the page. Don't worry about commas or spelling or picking the perfect word. Just word vomit it onto the page, how you see it in your head. The later drafts you're going to tweak it from what you see in your head to what you want the reader to see. So, Stephen King talks a lot about this in his book on writing. He says, if you have a table in the middle of the room and you say it's a metal table with wooden legs, well, that makes some readers stumble because when they first read table in the middle of the room, they were maybe picturing a big wooden table. And the minute you say metal table with wooden legs, that makes them stop and have to think about those things which were not the way that they first envisioned them. The material of the table is not integral to the plot, unless it is. I don't know, maybe it's a story about a metal table and that's significant in some way. Chances are it's not. So you don't have to describe every single little detail, like colors of things, textures of things, materials of things. You don't always have to describe a character's eye color, hair color, eye shape. Oh my goodness, the amount of manuscripts I've read with almond-shaped eyes and mocha-colored skin. Like, we don't need those details because they don't add anything. It's what you see in your head when you're writing, so it's fine for a first draft. But what you want the reader to see is the action and the scene. So those extraneous details are not as necessary. Oh yes, and including less attractive emotions. This, I think, is really important for YA in particular. Having your protagonist experience emotions like jealousy or anger or, those things that we all feel but are a little bit embarrassing. Those are really important because that allows your reader to align themselves with your character and know that, everyone feels that way. What do I have here for my writing tip? Oh yes. There are certain studies that will say YA is more for a female audience. There's this sort of idea that teenage boys don't read YA, that they prefer nonfiction at this age. And I just don't think that's true. So don't only cater your book toward one gender because I think that's an outdated idea as well. Boys read YA, boys love YA, so just your book can be for anyone. It doesn't have to be in first person. This is sort of calling back to that notion of interiority that we talked about in the middle grade slide. But a lot of books at this age and in this genre rather, are in first person just because it's a lot more immersive. And it's easier for readers to sort of align themselves with main characters. It doesn't have to be. Again, like Harry Potter's in third person and it sold a million, quadrillion copies. So it's by no means, a hard and fast rule, but a lot of YA books are written in first person, if that's helpful. There are other categories as well of kidlit. Of course, board books, leveled readers, poetry collections, novels in verse, etc., etc. I'm calling these just kidlit subcategories. They all have their own sort of conventions and guidelines, again, which all can be bent. But generally, these conventions and guidelines exist for a reason because, reading researchers, and sales data shows that readers prefer these sort of guidelines in these particular genres. That doesn't mean they can't be bent, but if you're a debut author or a first-time author, I suggest not bending the conventions a whole lot until you've established yourself as someone who can do the conventions well and understand the conventions and the guidelines, and then break them or bend them intentionally. Because if you don't fully understand the guidelines or the parameters or the conventions of the genre you're writing in, you can't, in my opinion, effectively bend those conventions or break those rules. So just, the guidelines exist for a reason. It's not to stifle your creativity or tell you you have to do it a certain way, but it is based on research and sales, and, they're there for a reason. And the people who are breaking those rules are people like, Philip Pullman or J.K. Rowling or, any of these authors that have already established themselves as, conventional authors before they go breaking the genre. So just something to keep in mind. This data is from 2020, so I'm not sure, I didn't have access to the records from 2021, or obviously it's not available from 2022 yet, but I thought that this was interesting. This was just sort of the genre of kidlit that is published in Canada, so by publishers that are based in Canada. And as you can see, like the vast majority of them are picture books, and then middle grade, and then very few sort of YA manuscripts get published. I thought it was interesting to include the race of the main characters. I was sort of hopeful that, you would see this sort of trending in the opposite direction by now. But yeah, you can see that the main character being white is still the vast majority of books that are published in Canada. So, there's still a ways to go. This is another interesting data piece. This is obviously our submissions data by genre as of 2020. It will have skewed a little bit since then, but just for the purposes of this presentation. As you can see, the vast majority, again, picture books. And the most depressing statistic on this slide probably is that only 1% of unsolicited submissions for picture books are accepted. Or, one manuscript in every 100 that gets submitted. Just because picture books they're so hard. They're so hard to do well. And we get so many. And, it's just, unfortunately, a kind of depressing numbers game. We get quite a bit of adult fiction. I know the last time that we opened our submissions, just in April of this past month, the vast majority of submissions that time around were adult fiction. So this data may have shifted a bit since then, but just to give you an idea, the vast majority of the submissions that we get at Nimbus are picture books, followed by adult and middle grade fiction, and then that 15% covers others, so things like adult nonfiction, children's nonfiction, YA, etc. Okay, so you've written your manuscript and you've got your query letter ready to go and you're ready to sell your book to the highest bidder. So these are tips maybe for your query letter or for your general pitch. You want to avoid, as we talked about, the moralistic overtones or overtly issue-driven stories. So when you're pitching your book, don't say that this is a book, to explain the AIDS pandemic to children, because that is going to be a hard no. Be careful about detail obsession or focus on the mundane, which is different from, you'll hear a lot of agents and editors talking about specificity and how they want to know specifics, but not mundane specifics. So, I can totally appreciate that that is a really annoying and hard to understand and hard to parse stance. But it just comes down to your intuition. So are you focusing on details like, for example, the material of the table, or are you focusing on, some other detail about the table that is actually integral to the plot? The other thing that I often tell authors to avoid, because I can understand the urge to sell your story as the story of my heart. This story means so much to me. I love the story with all my heart. I poured my heart and soul, my blood, sweat, and tears went into this story. That is wonderful. And I have no doubt true. Like, I 100% believe you, but that does not sell books alone. And the reality is that publishers are looking at your book as an investment. So just because you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into a book doesn't mean necessarily that it has all of the things that will make money, which unfortunately is what the publisher is most interested in, because they are a business and they see your book as a product. So that story of my heart narrative, while I understand it and I believe it, is not the most helpful when you are pitching your story or your manuscript to a publisher. It's better for you to take the angle of why this is a smart investment for the publisher. I talk a little bit about this gift perspective. So when you're like planning a birthday party for someone or planning a birthday present for someone, and you sort of include all these little details like, oh, in the card I'm going to put a little drawing of this or a little sticker of that. Oh, they'll love that. We'll put the cake with their favorite color icing because they'll notice that detail and they'll really like that. And you get that feeling of that anticipation feeling of, I can't wait for them to see all of these things and these little details that I put together for them. That is sort of how you want your book to feel as well. You want to have these little tiny nuggets that you are gifting to the reader, that you're gifting to the publisher, that you're gifting to, your audience, and that you can't wait for them to read, and it's so exciting. And if you approach it with that energy, I think that really shines through. And it's a really great angle to take when you're selling your book. Yes, and a little bit more about I understand how kind of depressing it is, but it is important that you take the angle of why this is a smart investment for the publisher, business-wise. I'm sorry. So now we're going to talk about the query letter that is going to accompany your submission to the publisher. This is the first thing an editor or an agent sees and reads, and often they will just read the query letter and then not read your manuscript if they don't like the query letter. So it's really important that it makes a good impression, but it's also really important that it demonstrates you know how to follow instructions. So every publisher will have different guidelines. Some publishers want 10 pages, some publishers want 3 pages, some publishers want the whole manuscript, some have specifics about font size and spacing and font face and all that sort of thing. You really need to read each publisher's guidelines and follow them to the letter. This is not the place for creativity. This is not the place for you to do something wacky so that you stand out from the crowd. Follow the guidelines. Don't submit genre fiction if the publisher does not publish genre fiction. Specifically, don't say, I know you don't publish genre fiction, but here's my genre fiction manuscript anyway. And, try to cater and choose your publisher based on, things that will fit your story, that your story fits that publisher because of X, Y, Z, and this is why. The other thing that a lot of agents talk a lot about is comps or comparable titles. So they ask you to compare your manuscript to other recent books. When I say recent, I mean in the last 5 years. So we're not comparing to Harry Potter, please. We're not comparing to Because of Winn-Dixie. We're not comparing to Bridge to Terabithia. We want modern, last 5 years, contemporary comps. So that shows that you are aware of what's currently in the market. It shows that you're aware of trends. It shows that you know what's happening in the market and that you read currently. And keep it short because, as we discussed earlier, editors and agents receive so many submissions, like hundreds. So if you have a 10-page query letter, I'm sorry, but I don't have the time to read it. I just don't. So try to keep everything in your query letter into 1 or 2 pages. If you're interested in query letter specifics or query letter workshops, the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast, that is what it's called, the Shit No One Tells You About Writing, is incredible. They have 2 literary agents for kidlit and for adult fiction. And they read query letters that come in and they critique them and they offer specifics on how they would make them better and why something's not working and how to improve it. It's really a very valuable resource. So if you're writing your query letter, I would suggest checking out a few of those episodes. They talk a lot about that specificity versus the mundane. They talk about details to include, what works, what doesn't. It's a really great resource, so I would recommend that highly. Okay, so let's say your manuscript is submitted. You crafted the perfect query letter. You followed the guidelines to the T. Now what? So this is a great time to start a new project or to start writing something completely different or to just take a little break, a little breather and do nothing. That's fine too. Or to just read in the genre. But It's a terrible time to reread your submission and make changes. Don't do that. I know it's so tempting because after you sent it and you've waited 6-7 weeks and you haven't heard anything, you think maybe I'll just go back and just look at what I sent. And then you start rereading and you want to make all these changes. And then you write to the editor and you say, oh, please review this manuscript instead of the one I sent. It's just not a good idea. It's going to make you second guess yourself, and just be confident. And, I understand that the wait is excruciating, but do not contact the agent or the editor or the publisher for a status update. Just, I know it's so hard, but just, it really plays against you when you call, and specifically when you call and say, I know I'm not supposed to call, but I just wanted to know. Editors and agents, we just have so much going on. And it's not that we don't respect your time. It's just that it makes us feel very harried when, you're working so hard to read all these manuscripts and then someone calls and says, essentially you're not working hard enough. It really does not do your manuscript or you as an author any favors. I completely understand the urge to do it, though. I'm not saying like on a human to human level, I don't get it. But just in the interest of you and your manuscript and giving everything the best shot, just leave it alone. So let's say you hear back from the editor or the agent or the publisher and it's a polite rejection. This, as you saw from the data, does not mean that your book is not a good book. It's probably more likely that there's just no room on the publisher's list, or maybe they have something similar that they've already contracted from 4 years ago, and the timing just doesn't work out. There are lots of factors that go into it. It's not just your writing is terrible and we're not interested. So please don't take it as a judgment that you need to stop writing or that your book is not worthy or not good. But also, please don't then turn around and tell that editor or agent or publisher that they're making a huge mistake. Or please don't ask them for more detailed feedback if they've already said they're not able to give it. Writing to say, yeah, okay, no problem, you rejected it, but can you tell me why? Like, what specifically didn't you like? You're not likely to get a response to that. This is a great time to revise your manuscript. And, if you're lucky, maybe the editor or agent has given you some tips on why they rejected it. I wouldn't bank on that just because of the time restrictions we talked about earlier, but this is a great time to go back, reread, revise, try to see if there are some places where you can tighten things up. Don't repitch it unless you've rewritten the manuscript substantially. I don't just mean like tweaking a scene here and there. I mean like started from scratch and rewrote it. It's also a great time to read the best-selling books in your genre to see what best-selling authors are doing and to see if maybe there's a way that you can incorporate some of those themes or trends or, concepts into your book, because that's what children are interested in reading right now. These are some great resources for authors of Kidlit. Podcasts, I mentioned The Shit No One Tells You About Writing, which is a really, really good one. The Picture Booksta Gang is another good one. It's Canadian, specifically about different picture books. They had a great episode recently called Where Are All the Fat People in Picture Books, which was like fascinating. It was very interesting. And the Good Story podcast, which is with a former editor and agent, Mary Cole, and she sort of talks about the craft of writing and the process of writing. So those are all three great podcasts. There are books and magazines, workshops. So if you're local here in Nova Scotia, the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia has some great workshops for members and non-members. So just check out their website and see what's on the go. Masterclass, it's $200. So I don't know that you need to spend that to have Judy Blume tell you that how to write a book. But, if that is something that is accessible to you and interesting to you, it certainly can't hurt. But I don't think that those sort of things are necessary by any stretch of the imagination. There are also lots of literary festivals. I have word on the street Halifax, but I just was talking to someone last month or maybe, earlier this year, And they were saying that Word on the Street Halifax is not happening anymore. So that one might have bitten the dust. But the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD, in Toronto is a really, really great one. And the last 2 years, they've had a really great digital virtual version of it that you can sort of, dip in and out of talks and presentations. And they've got a lot of really interesting workshops and things like that. I really recommend that one. And Telling Tales in Hamilton, as far as I know, they don't have a virtual component, but they do have a lot of great author talks and things like that. So festivals and events and things like that are always a good thing to attend. And if this were live, this would be the point where I would take any of your questions. But unfortunately, because it's pre-recorded, I won't be able to take any of your questions. And because I'm starting mat leave real soon, I probably won't be able to answer any emails either. So if you have specific questions, maybe the best thing to do would be to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is at EMCMACK, because my name is Emily Margaret Claire MacKinnon. So EMCMACK. So you can just reach out to me there and lob any questions from this presentation at me there. You can DM me if that's more comfortable for you, if you don't want it to be public. And otherwise, you could, pass on any questions to the Hackmatack organizers, and they could pass things on to me. I'll get to them when I get to them, but, I'm birthing a human here pretty soon, so I might have other priorities. And I thank you so much for your interest. I hope it was helpful. I'm sorry I droned on a little bit, but, once I get going, I'm hard to stop. So I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much.